In the heart of a bustling city, where tourists mingled with locals and the air buzzed with chatter, Corporal James Harrington stood tall. His red uniform, polished boots, and gleaming helmet made him an unmistakable figure against the backdrop of a historic monument. He was there to guard the site during a public event, ensuring safety and order. Though his role seemed routine, James carried himself with pride, embodying the discipline and dedication expected of a royal guard. The square was alive with activity. Families posed for pictures near the fountain. Street vendors called out to passers-by, selling snacks and souvenirs, and children laughed as they chased pigeons across the cobblestones. Yet, amidst this lively scene, something darker lurked in the shadows. A man whose presence would soon disrupt the harmony of the day. Derek Calloway had always been someone who thrived on stirring trouble. Known in his neighborhood for his loud opinions and abrasive behavior, he held deep prejudices that often spilled into public spaces. Today, Derek wasn't alone. He had brought along his German shepherd, Max, a large, muscular dog trained to obey, but also capable of intimidating anyone who crossed their path. As Derek walked through the crowd, his eyes landed on James, and an ugly sneer formed on his face. James, however, remained unfazed. Standing perfectly still, his posture radiated calmness despite the chaos around him. His training had taught him to stay focused no matter what distractions came his way. But Derek couldn't stand seeing someone so composed, especially someone like James, someone whose skin color and heritage represented everything Derek despised. To Derek, James didn't belong here, in his country, guarding his history. The thought fueled his anger, and he began muttering under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. At first, people ignored Derek's grumbling, brushing it off as harmless rambling. But as he drew closer to James, his words grew sharper, more pointed. Racial slurs slipped from his lips, cutting through the cheerful atmosphere like a knife. Some bystanders exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others simply looked away, unwilling to confront the tension brewing between the two men. James, though, kept his gaze fixed ahead, refusing to let Derek's venomous words shake him. What made Derek angrier was how unbothered James appeared. It was as if his insults were bouncing off an invisible shield. Frustrated by James's composure, Derek tightened his grip on Max's leash. His knuckles turned white as he tugged the dog closer, glaring at James with undisguised hatred. Max growled low in his throat, sensing his owner's rising agitation. The sound caught the attention of a few nearby visitors, who instinctively took a step back, unsure of what might happen next. Despite the growing unease in the air, James continued to stand firm. His mind raced, analyzing the situation without letting emotion cloud his judgment. He knew better than to react impulsively or escalate things unnecessarily. Instead, he focused on maintaining control, not just over himself, but over the environment around him. Little did anyone know, this moment was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would leave everyone questioning what true strength truly meant. Derek's frustration reached a boiling point as he realized his words were having no effect on James. The guard's unwavering composure only fueled Derek's anger, making him feel powerless and humiliated in front of the growing crowd. His face flushed red, veins bulging on his forehead as he clenched his fists. "You think you're better than me?" Derek spat, his voice rising above the noise of the square. "You don't belong here. Go back to where you came from." The insults hung heavy in the air, but James didn't flinch. He stood rooted to his spot, his eyes scanning the area calmly, taking in every detail. People around them began to notice the confrontation. Some stopped mid-step, their curiosity piqued, while others pretended not to see, hoping the tension would dissipate on its own. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering something urgent before hurrying away. The once lively atmosphere now felt charged with unease. But Derek wasn't done. His hatred had taken hold of him completely, clouding his judgment. In his mind, James's silence was an act of defiance, a personal insult. Desperate to assert dominance, Derek unclipped Max's leash with a sharp tug. The German shepherd, already tense from sensing his owner's hostility, immediately sprang into action. With a low growl that escalated into a ferocious bark, Max lunged forward, teeth bared, straight toward James. Time seemed to slow down for the bystanders watching in horror. Guests echoed through the square as people scrambled to get out of the way. Parents shielded their children, and some even turned away, unable to watch what they feared would be an inevitable attack. Derek smirked, crossing his arms smugly, convinced he had finally gotten the reaction he wanted. "Let's see how tough you are now," he shouted triumphantly. Yet James remained eerily calm. As Max charged at him, snarling and snapping, James didn't raise his hands defensively or try to run. Instead, he locked eyes with the dog, his expression steady and commanding. Without hesitation, he extended one hand slowly, palm facing outward, as if signaling for the dog to stop. To everyone's astonishment, Max froze mid-stride, his momentum halting abruptly. Confusion flickered in the dog's dark eyes, replacing the aggression that had driven him moments earlier. The crowd collectively held its breath, unsure of what they were witnessing. Was this some kind of trick, or was it skill? Derek's smug grin faltered as he watched the scene unfold. His prize dog, trained to obey his every command, was now sitting obediently at James's feet, tail thumping lightly against the ground. It was as though the dog had completely forgotten about Derek altogether. James knelt down slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He spoke softly, his voice carrying a tone of authority laced with kindness. "Easy now," he murmured, his words almost hypnotic. Max tilted his head slightly, ears perked up, as if trying to understand. Then, with a final wag of his tail, the dog relaxed entirely, leaning slightly into James's touch when he gently patted his head. Derek stared in disbelief, his face contorted with a mix of fury and embarrassment. "What did you do to my dog?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. But James ignored him, focusing instead on the animal, now resting peacefully by his side. The crowd, which had been frozen in shock just moments ago, began to murmur among themselves. Whispers of admiration spread quickly. How had James managed to defuse such a dangerous situation without raising a finger? As Derek fumbled for words, his bravado crumbling, it became clear that this encounter was far from over. What had started as a hateful provocation had transformed into something else entirely. A display of control, patience, and quiet strength that left everyone questioning who the real aggressor was. And for Derek, the worst part was yet to come. Over the next few weeks, James and Max settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural, as if they had been together for years. Each morning began with a brisk walk through the park near James's apartment. Max bounded ahead eagerly, his tail wagging furiously as he explored every tree, bench, and patch of grass. Passers-by often stopped to admire the handsome German shepherd, complimenting James on how well-behaved he was. "He's such a good boy," one woman cooed, bending down to pet Max. "You must be doing something right." James smiled, grateful for the compliments, but more so for the transformation he saw in Max. The dog who had once been tense and reactive, under Derek's care, was now confident and calm. It wasn't just obedience training that had made the difference, it was trust. Max had learned to rely on James, understanding that kindness and consistency would always guide their relationship. Every time James praised him or gave him a treat for following commands, Max's bond with his new owner grew stronger. At home, Max adapted quickly to apartment living. He had his favorite spots: the sunny corner by the window where he liked to nap, the soft blanket James had bought him, and the chew toy that never seemed to leave his side. James, too, found joy in the little routines they shared. After work, he'd toss a ball for Max in the hallway, laughing as the dog sprinted after it with uncontainable enthusiasm. On weekends, they ventured farther, exploring trails outside the city where Max could run freely without a leash. But beyond the everyday joys, James noticed something deeper unfolding within himself. Caring for Max gave him a renewed sense of purpose. As a royal guard, his days were structured around duty and discipline. But this new role allowed him to connect with life on a different level. Max reminded him of the importance of patience, empathy, and unconditional love. Qualities James realized weren't just valuable in relationships with animals, but with people too. Their bond didn't go unnoticed. Friends and colleagues marveled at how seamlessly James had integrated Max into his life. "I didn't think you'd pull it off," joked Thomas, a fellow guard, during one of their coffee breaks. "You've got your hands full with that big guy." James laughed, glancing over at Max, who lay patiently at his feet. "It's not always easy," he admitted, "but it's worth it." One evening, as James scrolled through social media, he came across a post from the animal shelter. They had organized a community event called Paws for Peace, aimed at promoting responsible pet ownership and raising awareness about the impact of abuse on animals. To James's surprise, Clara had tagged him in the announcement, inviting him to speak about his experience with Max. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his forte. But then he remembered why he had adopted Max in the first place. If sharing their story could inspire others to give neglected animals a second chance, it would be worth stepping out of his comfort zone. The day of the event arrived, and James stood nervously behind the podium, Max sitting proudly beside him. The crowd listened intently as James recounted the events that led to their meeting, from the tense encounter in the square to the decision to adopt Max. His voice wavered at times, but when he looked down at Max, whose eyes gleamed with loyalty and affection, he found courage. "Max taught me that everyone deserves a second chance," James said, his words resonating deeply with the audience. "Whether it's a person or an animal, we all have the capacity to change when given love and guidance." When he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. People lined up afterward to meet Max, showering him with pats and praise. Several attendees approached James privately, sharing stories of their own rescued pets or expressing gratitude for his message. One woman even handed him a small painting of Max she had created, saying, "This is my way of thanking you for showing us what true strength looks like." As the event drew to a close, James felt a profound sense of fulfillment. What had started as a single act of compassion had blossomed into something far greater, a partnership built on trust, growth, and mutual healing. For Max, it meant escaping a life of fear and finding a home filled with love. For James, it meant rediscovering the power of empathy and realizing that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples of change far beyond what anyone might expect. Driving home that night, James glanced at Max, who rested his chin on the car door, gazing out at the passing lights. Their journey was still unfolding, but one thing was certain. Together, they had already overcome so much, and there was no limit to what they could achieve moving forward. As the crowd murmured in awe, James slowly rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and measured. He didn't rush or show any signs of arrogance, despite the incredible feat he had just accomplished. Instead, his focus remained on Max, who sat quietly by his side, completely at ease. The dog's earlier aggression was gone, replaced by a calmness that seemed almost unnatural given the circumstances. Durek, still standing a few feet away, looked utterly bewildered. his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. James turned his attention to Derek now, his piercing gaze locking onto the man who had unleashed such chaos. For a moment, there was silence. No barking, no shouting, just the distant hum of the city in the background. Then James spoke, his voice firm but not loud, commanding without being harsh. "You think hate makes you strong," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "But it doesn't. All it does is expose your weakness." The simplicity of his statement struck a chord with those watching. Some people nodded subtly, while others exchanged glances, silently agreeing with James's perspective. Derek, however, bristled at the comment. His hands clenched into fists again, and he took a step forward, as if ready to argue. But before he could say anything, James continued, his tone unwavering. "Even animals can sense fear and anger. They respect those who lead with patience and kindness, not cruelty." Max, as if understanding every word, wagged his tail gently, leaning slightly toward James instead of his own owner. This small gesture seemed to infuriate Derek even more. His face twisted in frustration as he realized the dog he had trained so rigorously was now responding to someone else entirely. "What did you do to him?" Derek snapped, his voice rising once more. "This isn't right. You're tricking him somehow." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he knelt down again beside Max, speaking softly to the dog in a reassuring tone. "It's okay," he murmured, running his hand along Max's back. "You're safe." The dog closed his eyes briefly, as though savoring the comfort of James's presence. It was clear that Max trusted James implicitly, something Derek couldn't comprehend or accept. The crowd around them began to shift uncomfortably. While some were fascinated by James's ability to calm the dog, others felt uneasy about Derek's erratic behavior. A young woman holding her child whispered to her companion, "That poor man has no idea what he's doing wrong." Nearby, an elderly man shook his head disapprovingly, muttering under his breath about how Derek's actions reflected poorly on everyone. The tide of public opinion was turning against Derek, and he could feel it. For all his bluster, Derek suddenly seemed smaller, less intimidating. His bravado wavered as he glanced around, noticing the judgmental stares directed his way. He opened his mouth to defend himself, perhaps to hurl another insult or demand answers, but nothing came out. Instead, he stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The confident, aggressive demeanor he had displayed moments ago had vanished, leaving behind only insecurity and shame. Meanwhile, James remained composed, exuding a quiet strength that contrasted sharply with Derek's unraveling composure. He stood up straight, brushing off his uniform as if to signal that the matter was settled, at least for him. But he knew this wasn't over. The situation had drawn too much attention, and the authorities would likely be involved soon. Still, James didn't dwell on that. His priority was ensuring Max's well-being and making sure the dog wouldn't pose a threat to anyone else. As two police officers pushed their way through the growing crowd, Derek's panic became evident. He shifted from foot to foot, casting nervous glances between James, the officers, and the spectators. Whatever control he thought he had over the situation had slipped entirely out of his grasp. And as the officers approached, asking questions and taking statements from witnesses, it became increasingly clear that Derek's actions would have consequences far beyond this moment. James handed Max's leash over to one of the officers, explaining calmly how the dog had responded to his commands. He emphasized that Max wasn't inherently dangerous. It was the environment and Derek's behavior that had provoked the attack. The officer nodded, jotting notes down as he promised to ensure the dog was cared for properly. With that, James stepped back, his role in the incident complete. Yet the impact of what had transpired lingered in the air, a powerful reminder of the difference between aggression and true strength. Months passed, and the bond between James and Max only grew stronger. Their daily routines became a source of comfort not just for them, but for those around them as well. Neighbors often smiled when they saw the pair heading out for their morning walks, Max striding confidently by James's side. Children would wave excitedly, calling out, "Hi, Max," as the dog paused to sniff their hands or wag his tail in greeting. Even the local shopkeepers knew Max by name, slipping him an occasional treat when James wasn't looking. But it wasn't just their immediate circle that felt the impact of their story. The viral videos and articles about James's encounter with Derek continued to circulate online, sparking conversations about prejudice, redemption, and the power of compassion. Teachers used the incident as a case study in classrooms, encouraging students to reflect on how empathy could diffuse conflict. Animal shelters reported an increase in adoption inquiries, with many citing James and Max's story as inspiration. People began seeing rescue animals not as damaged or dangerous, but as individuals deserving of love and understanding. For James, this newfound attention came with its challenges. While he appreciated the support, he remained grounded, avoiding the spotlight whenever possible. He turned down interviews and declined offers to appear on television shows, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. "I didn't do any of this for recognition," he told Clara during one of his visits to the shelter. "If sharing our story helps even one person think differently about animals, or people, then that's enough." Max, too, had become something of a local celebrity. Strangers stopped James regularly to ask if they could take a picture with the gentle giant. One day, while walking through the park, a young boy approached hesitantly, clutching a stuffed animal dog. "Is it okay if I hug him?" the boy asked shyly. James nodded, and the child wrapped his arms around Max's neck, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. When the boy pulled away, his eyes sparkled with happiness. "Thank you," he whispered, before running back to his parents. Moments like these reminded James why he had made the decision to adopt Max. It wasn't just about saving a dog. It was about creating moments of connection and joy. As time went on, James noticed subtle changes in himself as well. Caring for Max had taught him patience and resilience, qualities that served him both personally and professionally. His fellow guards commented on how calm and composed he seemed, even in high-pressure situations. "You've always been steady," Thomas said during one of their shifts, "but now it's like nothing rattles you." James chuckled, glancing at Max resting quietly nearby. "Let's just say I've got a good teacher," he replied. Meanwhile, Derek's fate served as a stark contrast to James's journey. After facing multiple charges, including reckless endangerment and violating animal welfare laws, Derek was sentenced to community service and mandatory counseling. Though some dismissed his punishment as lenient, others saw it as an opportunity for reflection and growth. Whether Derek chose to learn from his mistakes remained unclear, but his public shaming left a lasting impression on the community, reinforcing the importance of accountability. One crisp autumn afternoon, James decided to revisit the square where everything had begun. The historic monument stood tall against the golden hues of fallen leaves, surrounded by families enjoying the cool weather. As James walked with Max by his side, memories of that tense day flooded back. The angry shouts, the barking dog, the crowd watching nervously. But instead of bitterness, James felt gratitude. That moment of chaos had led him to Max, teaching him lessons about strength, forgiveness, and second chances. A group of tourists recognized James and approached him cautiously. "Are you the guard from that video?" one of them asked. James nodded, smiling slightly as Max sat obediently beside him. The tourists thanked him for being such a role model, snapping photos before continuing on their way. Watching them leave, James placed a hand on Max's head, feeling the warmth of the sun on his shoulders. Life had come full circle in unexpected ways. What started as a confrontation fueled by hate had transformed into a story of hope and healing. For James and Max, it was proof that kindness could overcome aggression, that trust could replace fear, and that redemption was always within reach, for humans and animals alike. Together, they had shown the world that true strength wasn't about domination, but about compassion. And as they strolled home under the fading light of the setting sun, James knew their journey was far from over. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side, ready to inspire and be inspired. The next morning, news of the incident had spread like wildfire. Social media platforms were flooded with posts about James's remarkable composure and his ability to diffuse a dangerous situation with grace and patience. Videos captured by bystanders showed snippets of the confrontation, the hateful slurs hurled by Durek, Max lunging forward, and James calmly extending his hand to stop the dog. The footage quickly went viral, sparking debates about prejudice, responsibility, and the power of nonviolent responses. Headlines praised James as a symbol of resilience and dignity. Royal Guard shows true strength against hate, read one article, while another proclaimed how one man's calmness disarmed aggression, literally. Comment sections were filled with admiration for James, though some criticized Derek's actions, calling them reckless and unacceptable. People shared personal stories of overcoming hate or standing up to aggression without resorting to violence, inspired by James's example. Meanwhile, Derek faced mounting consequences for his behavior. News outlets identified him, highlighting his history of inflammatory remarks and run-ins with the law. Friends and acquaintances distanced themselves publicly, embarrassed by their association with him. At the police station, Derek was formally charged with inciting violence and endangerment in a public space. His attempts to justify his actions fell flat, especially when investigators reviewed witness statements and video evidence. By the time he was released on bail, Derek's reputation was in tatters. James, on the other hand, received an outpouring of support. Messages of gratitude poured into the Royal Guard's office, from ordinary citizens, community leaders, and even politicians. Some praised his professionalism, while others commended his compassion toward Max despite the circumstances. A local school even invited him to speak at an assembly about conflict resolution and leadership. Though flattered, James remained humble, insisting that he had simply done his duty. Amidst all the attention, James couldn't forget about Max. He visited the shelter again the following day, bringing along a toy and some treats. When he entered the kennel area, Max greeted him enthusiastically, wagging his tail so hard it seemed like his entire body moved with it. "Hey, buddy," James said warmly, kneeling down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Missed me?" Max responded by licking James's hand, his eyes shining with unmistakable affection. Watching this interaction, Clara approached with a smile. "I think he's starting to see you as his person," she remarked. "You've really made a difference in his behavior. He's calmer and more responsive than ever." James nodded thoughtfully, his expression softening. "He's been through a lot," he said quietly. "But he deserves a fresh start, a home where he feels safe and loved." As he spoke, an idea began to take shape in his mind. Though adopting a dog wasn't something he planned, the bond he shared with Max felt undeniable. He knew caring for Max would require adjustments, longer walks during breaks, rearranging his schedule, but none of that mattered compared to giving the dog a better life. That evening, after much deliberation, James submitted an application to adopt Max. He explained his reasons honestly. How he connected with the dog, understood his needs, and wanted to provide him with stability. Shelter staff reviewed his application carefully, impressed by his dedication and experience with animals. After a brief home inspection and a few discussions, they approved the adoption, confident that Max would thrive under James's care. When James returned to the shelter to pick up Max, the dog practically leaped into his arms, nearly knocking him over with excitement. Clara handed James a folder containing Max's medical records and training tips, along with a heartfelt thank you note from the staff. "Take good care of him," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "And thank you for stepping up. Not everyone would have taken this step." As James loaded Max into his car, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. This was a new chapter for both of them. Driving home, Max sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally resting his head on James's arm as if to say, "Thank you." Back at his apartment, James introduced Max to his new surroundings. The dog sniffed every corner curiously before settling down on a soft blanket James had laid out for him. Watching Max curl up contentedly, James realized this decision wasn't just about saving a dog. It was about proving that redemption and second chances were possible, no matter the past. For James, it was also a reminder that kindness could bridge divides, whether between humans or across species. And as he sat beside Max, scratching his fur gently, James knew they were ready to face whatever came next, together. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered to life and the square emptied of its daytime bustle, James found himself unable to shake off the events of the day. Though his shift had ended hours ago, he decided to visit the local animal shelter where Max had been taken temporarily. It wasn't just curiosity driving him, it was concern. Despite everything that had happened, James couldn't stop thinking about the dog. He knew Max wasn't inherently dangerous. The poor animal had simply been caught in the crossfire of his owner's anger and prejudice. When James arrived at the shelter, he was greeted by a friendly staff member named Clara. She recognized him immediately from the news reports circulating online and thanked him warmly for his actions earlier that day. "We don't see many people handle situations like that with such calmness," she said, smiling. "You're quite the hero around here." James chuckled softly, brushing off the compliment. "I'm no hero," he replied modestly. "I just did what I thought was right. How's the dog doing?" Clara led him through the shelter's corridors until they reached a quiet room where Max was being held. Through the glass window, James could see the German Shepherd lying on a blanket, his ears perked up at the sound of approaching footsteps. When James entered the room, Max's tail began wagging instantly. The dog stood up, pressing his nose against the bars of the kennel, clearly eager to greet him. "He seems to really like you," Clara observed, opening the door so James could step inside. "Do you have experience with dogs?" James nodded as he knelt down beside Max, who immediately leaned into him, seeking affection. "I grew up on a farm," he explained. "We always had working dogs. They helped herd sheep and guard the property. My dad taught me how to train them using patience and positive reinforcement. Animals respond better when you treat them with kindness instead of fear or punishment." As James spoke, he gently stroked Max's fur, speaking softly to reassure the dog. Max closed his eyes contentedly, his tail thumping rhythmically against the floor. It was clear the bond between them had deepened since their encounter earlier that day. Clara watched the interaction with admiration, her expression softening. "You're amazing with him," she said. "He's usually so tense around strangers, but look at him now, completely relaxed." James smiled faintly, though his thoughts drifted back to Derek. He wondered how someone could mistreat such a loyal and intelligent creature. Max wasn't born aggressive. He had learned to react based on the environment created by his owner. James knew firsthand how much influence humans had over animals' behavior, and it saddened him to think about all the harm caused by neglect or abuse. After spending some time with Max, James began teaching him basic commands, reinforcing trust and obedience. He used treats and praise to reward the dog for following instructions, ensuring each interaction was positive. Max responded eagerly, picking up cues quickly. By the end of the session, the dog was sitting, staying, and even giving a playful paw when prompted. Clara clapped her hands in delight. "You've worked wonders with him," she exclaimed. "If only all our volunteers were this skilled." James laughed lightly, scratching behind Max's ears one last time before standing up. "He's a good boy," James said sincerely. "He just needs someone who understands him and gives him structure." As he glanced at Max, an unexpected thought crossed his mind. What would happen to the dog now? Would he end up back with Derek, doomed to repeat the cycle of tension and aggression? Or worse, would he be abandoned if Derek refused to take responsibility? The idea weighed heavily on James. He didn't want Max to suffer because of his owner's mistakes. Before leaving the shelter, he turned to Clara and asked hesitantly, "What happens next for him? Does he go back to his owner?" Clara sighed, shaking her head. "That depends. If Derek is willing to cooperate and prove he can provide a safe home, we'll consider it. But given the circumstances, it's unlikely. We'll probably put Max up for adoption if no one steps forward." James nodded slowly, his mind racing. He hadn't planned on adopting a dog. He lived in a small apartment and worked long hours. But something about Max tugged at his heartstrings. The dog had shown incredible resilience despite the challenges he'd faced, and James felt a responsibility to ensure Max found a loving home. As he left the shelter that night, he couldn't help but wonder, could he be the one to give Max the second chance he deserved? Though the decision wasn't made yet, one thing was certain. James's connection with Max had grown far beyond a simple act of kindness. It had become a reminder of the power of empathy and redemption, not just for animals, but for people too. And as he walked away, Max's happy bark echoed faintly in his ear. As the two police officers began questioning witnesses, the crowd around James and Derek grew thicker, buzzing with whispered conversations. People recounted what they had seen, how Derek had hurled insults, unleashed his dog in a fit of rage, and how James had calmly diffused the situation without raising a hand. Some described it as unbelievable, while others called it inspiring. The officers listened intently, jotting notes and occasionally nodding as the story unfolded. Derek, meanwhile, struggled to defend himself. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a mix of frustration and panic. He tried to argue that James had somehow manipulated Max, accusing him of using tricks or hidden commands to confuse the dog. But his words fell flat, especially when the officers asked for evidence. "He's lying," Derek insisted, pointing at James. "There's no way my dog would listen to him like that unless he did something sneaky." James, standing nearby, didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he let the officers handle the situation, keeping his focus on staying calm and cooperative. When one of the officers approached him, asking for his side of the story, James spoke clearly and respectfully. "The dog responded because I stayed calm and gave him clear guidance," James explained. "Animals react to energy. If you're aggressive, they'll mirror that. If you're patient and firm, they'll trust you." His explanation resonated not just with the officers, but also with the onlookers. Several people nodded approvingly, their respect for James growing even stronger. One woman stepped forward, volunteering to share her account. "I saw everything," she said firmly. "That man," she gestured toward Derek, was shouting hateful things before he set his dog loose. This guard didn't do anything wrong. In fact, he handled it perfectly. Other witnesses chimed in, backing up her statement. A teenage boy holding a skateboard added, "Yeah, the guy was yelling awful stuff. Everyone heard it." And then he sixed his dog on the guard. It was scary. Even some of Durek's own acquaintances who happened to be in the crowd avoided making eye contact with him, unwilling to vouch for his behavior. For Durek, this public shaming was unbearable. His face turned bright red as he realized the weight of the situation. Not only had he lost control of his dog, but he had also exposed his prejudices in front of dozens of strangers. Worse still, instead of intimidating James, he had ended up looking foolish and out of line. As the officers continued gathering statements, Derek's agitation grew. He shifted from foot to foot, muttering under his breath, clearly searching for a way to salvage his dignity, or at least escape the spotlight. But there was no escaping now. With multiple accounts corroborating James's version of events, the officers had little choice but to take action. They informed Durek that he would need to accompany them to the station to answer further questions about his conduct. "This is ridiculous." Durek protested, his voice rising again. "You can't arrest me for this. My dog wasn't hurting anyone." One of the officers raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Sir, you released your dog in a crowded area after provoking another individual. That's considered reckless endangerment. You'll have to come with us." Durek sputtered, trying to argue, but the officers weren't swayed. They guided him toward their patrol car, ignoring his protests as they opened the door and ushered him inside. As Derek sat fuming in the backseat, glaring daggers at James through the window, the crowd began to disperse. Many people lingered long enough to thank James for his composure and bravery. "You handled that beautifully," one elderly man said, tipping his hat. "Most people would have lost their cool, but you showed real strength." Others echoed similar sentiments, shaking James's hand or simply offering warm smiles. Though grateful for the support, James remained humble. "I was just doing my job," he replied with a small smile. "And I care about animals. They deserve kindness, not cruelty." His words struck a chord, reminding everyone present of the importance of treating both people and animals with compassion. Before leaving, the officers assured James that Max would be taken to a local animal shelter temporarily, where professionals could assess his temperament and ensure he was cared for properly. They praised James for his handling of the situation, acknowledging that his actions had likely prevented a much worse outcome. "We'll make sure the dog gets the help he needs," one officer promised. "And we'll keep you updated." With that, the commotion subsided, leaving James alone in the square once more. The chaos had passed, but its impact lingered, not just in the minds of those who had witnessed it, but within James himself. As he adjusted his helmet and resumed his post near the monument, he reflected on the day's events. Hate and aggression might grab,